We are on to chapter 16. So I'm going to cover chapter 16 and 17 together, mostly because the first three lessons of chapter 16 are not real interesting, I guess. I mean, in some ways they are. Um, but what we're going to do today is just kind of overview those first three lessons. They are just kind of what did Darwin, so we're going to be talking about Charles Darwin, of course, because this chapter or this unit is on evolution. What did he observe that led him to think that organisms can change? What did he learn about, and who influenced him in his thought process as he came up with what we now call the theory of evolution? Okay, so we are going to start and overview the first three lessons. So let's start with Darwin. Darwin was a naturalist, which is what we would call today a biologist. He had actually set out to become a doctor. But if you know anything about medical practice of like the 1800s, it was pretty gruesome, and he decided he didn't want to do that. So instead, he became a biologist, and he went on a voyage around the world. It was a 5-year voyage um, uh, on the ship, the HMS Beagle. Okay, so as he's traveling around the world, he is collecting all these different specimens, different plants and animals, and just kind of looking at how the world was constantly changing. It's one of the things that he noticed was that we have all of these things that there's got to be a relationship. So he is credited with um, the idea of, all right, not discovering so much, but he gets credit for what we call evolution. Evolution is just any change that occurs in a species over time. It is not necessarily, so there's like two schools of evolution. There's two types of evolution. You have microevolution, which is what we're going to be focusing on, and microevolution is where one species is accumulating a variety of changes over time. And then there's macroevolution, which is where one species eventually changes so much that it is now a new species. That one is less evidence for, but we're going to look at the different evidence for both. As Darwin was traveling, he found three very distinctive patterns in the diversity of the living things around the world. So, the first thing he found was that species vary globally, which means that he found these similar but not the same types of animals that would inhabit similar types of habitats around the globe. Okay, so um, within any ecosystem, you're going to have organisms that fill each role. Okay, and so you would have in different ecosystems, you would have similar organisms filling the same roles. It's oh goodness, excuse me. So that's what he was noticing, was that in this environment, this organism fills this role, and then over here, it's instead, something similar. So in one environment, you would find, the tiger is kind of the big cat, the top of the food chain, big predator, and then in a different ecosystem, you would find that to be the lion. Okay, so they're very similar animal species, and they inhabit and they kind of have a similar role in their environment. He also found that species vary locally, which means that within the same habitat, uh, you or the same ecosystem, you would have very similar organisms that might have just some slight differences to be able to inhabit just a little bit different of what we would call a niche. Okay, they might have just a slightly different job. So, one example is some birds. They're called finches, and they come in a lot of different kinds of finches. And so some of them would like live on more on the ground and eat the food found on the ground, and some would occupy like the lower branches of trees, and some would occupy like the higher branches of the trees. So they have these very slight differences that allow them to um, have very slightly different roles in their ecosystem, but the animals themselves are pretty similar to one another. Okay, they would be related. And then the third thing that he noticed was that species vary over time. So fossils of extinct animals that are similar but not the same as living species. So there was some change that occurred from the fossilized version to the living version. So based on this, he noted that species are not fixed, that they can change. There's some natural process that allows species to change and adapt to their environment. So there were several people that influenced the way Darwin thought. Uh, so most of this has to do with geology and the Earth being much older than um, some people think. So there's two schools of thoughts. There's the old Earth, which is the Earth is millions of years old, and then there's young Earth, which is the Earth is about like 10 to 12,000 years old. And there's evidence for both, depending on how you want to look at it. So Darwin's thinking, especially in terms of evolution, because evolution would take a very long time, was shaped by a couple of geologists who suggested that the Earth was very, very old, that it was much older than most people of Darwin's day thought. So these two guys are Hutton and Lyell. They were both suggesting that the Earth was old, and that that was based on the fact that any processes that changed Earth in the past are the same as what's changing Earth now. And those changes were occurring at the same rate. So, in order to have the Earth that we have now, it had to take a lot longer than the 10 to 12,000 years that was kind of the main thought of the day. Hutton based his on plate tectonics, and the fact that the Earth has to be very old for like the mountains that we see to have been able to form. Lyell was explaining past events and what would have created the things that we see in terms of the processes that get observed currently. Okay, like anything by like presently observed or currently observed, um, things within like um, written history and stuff like that. Like, what are we observing and how can we explain these different events? Lamarck. So Lamarck was a biologist who presented this idea of acquired characteristics, the fact that organisms could change by selectively using or not using various body parts. And then they could pass on these acquired traits. So Lamarck's ideas are largely wrong. And so as you evaluate, anytime you're doing a study on evolution, you really need to be careful and look for Lamarckian ideas. So for Lamarck, let's take the giraffe. So Lamarck would have said that the giraffe evolved, right? He got his long neck because he would have to stretch. A giraffe would have to stretch out to reach the leaves of the tree to eat. And so as he would stretch out, that would make his neck grow longer. And then he could pass that on to his offspring. And so the next generation would stretch even more, and they would pass that on. And the next generation would be able to stretch even more. So eventually we get these giraffes with these really, really long necks because they were stretching them out to eat. And that's not how genetics works. So as we evaluate Lamarck's ideas, evolution does not mean better. We're going to talk about like natural selection and how, and that's really the only process where we get evolution is through natural selection. And so evolution does not mean better. It's not necessarily progressing towards a goal. So a lot of Lamarck's ideas were that they kind of were based on this assumption that we're evolving to become better. And that's not always what happens. We also know that we can't pass on acquired traits. The only genes that can be passed on are going to occur in the germline, right? The ones that create the egg and the sperm cells. He did, though, link like environment and body structure. So giraffes do eat leaves out of trees that tend to be tall, but more likely than the stretching and passing on the stretching of the neck. It's just that the giraffes with longer necks can reach their food. And so they have a gene or probably multiple genes that control the length of their neck. And if they have a longer neck, they get to eat. And so they get to survive and reproduce. And if you're a giraffe with a really short neck, you don't get to eat because you can't reach the food. So you die and you don't get to pass on your genes for having the shorter neck. Okay. But he did at least notice, hey, they're eating leaves out of high trees and they have this long neck, and that's probably helpful for eating the leaves. Another idea that kind of came into play as Darwin was creating his, or kind of wow, words are hard today. As he's putting all of his thoughts together, which I clearly cannot do. There's Thomas Malthus. And Malthus said that if the population continues to grow unchecked, there won't be enough food and there's not enough living space for everyone. So this is why we have war, famine, and disease, because that helps to control our population growth. And he's not entirely wrong, but it did lead to this whole idea of like who gets to survive and why is it that those individuals get to survive, which those were kind of some of the questions that Darwin was asking as he was observing all of these things and putting together his thoughts. Who gets to survive the war, famine, and disease? Is there a reason why one individual might survive over another? And sometimes there is, and sometimes there isn't. The last thing that Darwin looked at was artificial selection. So we also call this selective breeding. This is when there is variation, specifically amongst animals, but we do this with plants as well. There's variation already, and humans are going to select for the version of the trait that we find the most useful. So, for instance, dairy cows. If you have a dairy farm, you want cows that produce a lot of milk. So your best milk producers are the ones you're probably going to breed to produce a new generation of really good milk producers. Okay? And then apply that to whatever form of animal or plant that you want that we might selectively breed for. Okay? So there is some natural variation, and if humans can select for various traits, maybe nature can too. So we'll get into natural selection in a little bit, or right now. So Darwin put all of his thoughts together and he came up with this idea of evolution, change in a species over time through the process of natural selection. In order for natural selection to occur, you have to have these three things. There has to be a struggle for existence. There has to be too many individuals and not enough resources. So we have competition for who gets to survive. That leads to variation and adaptation. So there are natural variations for most of our traits, and some of those variations will make an individual better suited to the environment, which means they might get to get those resources better than somebody who is less well suited to the environment. Okay, so being a faster predator, the faster you are, the more likely you are to catch your prey, right? Or if you are prey, if you are better camouflaged than somebody else, you're in blend in, you're not as likely to get eaten. Okay, so we call these adaptations. An adaptation is it has to be a heritable characteristic. So you have to be able to pass it on to your offspring, and it has to increase your ability to survive and reproduce. Okay, so an adaptation is going to increase your ability to survive and reproduce in your environment. So, because of the struggle for existence and the fact that there's variation and adaptation, we get the survival of the fittest. So, fitness in this sense is describing how well an organism can survive and reproduce. Because if you're more fit to your environment, you're going to survive and have more offspring, which means you're passing on your genes for whatever trait that makes you more suited to the environment. You're passing those on more. Okay. So, survival of the fittest is the individuals who are the best suited to the environment have more offspring, pass on their particular adaptations more often. Okay, so that leads us to natural selection. Okay, and natural selection and survival of the fittest are very much the same thing. So we have this process where organisms that are more suited, are better suited to their local environment, survive more often, they reproduce more often, so they leave behind more offspring with their better adaptations. Okay, so you do have to have more individuals than resources so that there's competition, natural variation within this trait because everybody's the same, it doesn't really matter. And variable fitness, that some form, not only is there variation, but some form is better than the other. Okay. So natural selection is a slow process. It changes from one generation to the next as we build up these adaptations within that population. Okay, so individuals do not evolve, but populations can. Okay. And that's just, it happens slowly from one generation to the next. They slowly become better adapted, or if the environment suddenly changes, then suddenly we need, some of our individuals that maybe weren't so fit before. Well, now they are because they have a form of the trait that lets them survive and reproduce. Okay. So it tends to be kind of in this state of flux where it could be changing continuously back and forth, even sometimes. Darwin's idea of evolution was also based on this idea of common descent. So, common descent means that all species are descended from common ancestors. So, from this, he could create evolutionary trees, kind of like a family tree that showed how all the species could be traced back to ancient species. This is also called descent with modification, and we'll look at it some more as we go through. But descent with modification just means that there could be enough changes to a population that it would be considered a new species. That we now have this change that makes this, maybe we split one population into two. And now we have two groups that are distinctive from each other. And we'll talk later on about how that can happen. All right. That's the end of the notes for today. So you do have a homework. It does cover all three lessons, but they are labeled as far as like which lesson you should be looking in for the answers. Okay, so um, pay attention to that. So you're not looking in lesson one when you should be looking in lesson two. Um, you should have gotten your review already. Again, it's kind of long because we are covering a lot of information. So I would recommend that you might get started on that sooner rather than later. Don't put it off to the last day and then expect to be able to ask me lots and lots of questions.